Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program tonight. My name is Nic Scoppettuolo, and I'm a librarian for the Connolly Branch of the Boston Public Library. We're presenting this program in partnership with the Jamaica Plain Historical Society, and I want to thank Gretchen Grosier for handling the tech side of everything tonight. We're excited to have Dr. Wendy L. Rouse here with us to discuss her book, Public Faces, Secret Lives, A Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement. And following the talk, we'll have time for an audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature for that. And then we'll conclude the program at 7:30. I also want to mention this program is being recorded tonight, and it'll be uploaded later to the Jamaica Plain Historical Society YouTube channel and to their website. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Rouse. She's Associate Professor of History at San Jose State University. Her research is focused on the history of gender and sexuality, and she's written 2 other books on the history of women and children in the United States during the Progressive Era. The first was The Children of Chinatown, Growing Up Chinese American in San Francisco, 1850 to 1920. Most historical research on early Chinatown has focused on men, but she looks at the role of children and families in building the Chinese American community and also in the fight against policies of exclusion and segregation. Her second book was Her Own Hero, The Origins of the Women's Self-Defense Movement. And it examines the rise in popularity of self-defense like boxing and jujitsu among women in the early 20th century, and then places it within the broader women's rights movement and the suffrage movement, which brings us to her current book that she'll be discussing tonight, Public Faces, Secret Lives, which uncovers the queer history of the women's suffrage movement that has been mostly erased. And she tells some of their individual stories. Welcome, Wendy, and thanks so much for joining us here tonight.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. And happy Pride Month, everyone. It's kind of exciting because I get to talk about the queer history of the suffrage movement during Pride Month. So thank you for asking me to do that. And let me share my screen first, and then I'll get started. So this whole book project started years ago. I've always been interested in the women's suffrage movement. I get to teach it every year because I teach US history. And one of the things that I really enjoy when I'm teaching about the suffrage movement is the stories of individuals and the stories of the women who made the suffrage movement possible. But I began to notice that I was more and more curious about their relationships, specifically about the impact of their suffrage campaigning on their personal relationships. And so that led me into kind of exploring what impact it had with their spouses and their family members. And in the process, I realized just how many of these individuals would be considered queer in our modern terms. So that's how this research started. And when I decided I wanted to delve into the private lives and kind of uncover this queer history, I realized how much of it has actually been erased over time because of sexism, homophobia, transphobia, et cetera. So I want you to know that recovering this history is very complex because so much of the evidence is lost. And so we end up having to kind of read between the lines of what's happening with a lot of these sources. So the first thing I just wanted to do with the book was kind of acknowledge that there was a queer history of the suffrage movement, because I feel like that's something that often gets overlooked. And it seems like an obvious point, but it's an essential point because it also helps us to start to talk about erasure and what that means in history. And I think it's also important to make the point that queer suffragists were instrumental to the suffrage movement. Many of them were leaders of the movement, and then others were kind of the radical outcasts who were pushed to the margins of the movement. So it's really important to kind of look at all of these individuals and how they navigated their personal lives, their public and their private lives. And I want you just to remember as we go through this presentation that there's only fragments here. We only have little bits of information about these people's lives. And so we obviously will never know the full story. But I think these pieces are fascinating and they show just how much work can still be done to try to get at the queer history of this movement. And just a quick note, I'm going to use the word queer a lot in this presentation, and I do that on purpose as an umbrella term to talk about what today we might identify as the LGBTQ community. But at that time, as you know, the terms we use now are not the terms that they used back then. And so when I use the word queer, I'm talking about people who defied the gender and sexual norms of their day. They were kind of operating outside what was considered the heteronormative structure of their time period, the cisgender heteronormative structure. And if these people were alive today, they might identify as lesbian, gay, bi, trans, genderqueer, gender fluid, but we don't really know because those labels didn't exist to them back then. Okay, but queer people have always existed, so that's part of why I want to talk about it in that broad way. So first, I think it's important to understand how suffragists were framed in the mainstream. And the thing that you need to know is that the anti-suffrage movement really came at suffragists for what they perceived as an attempt to upend the existing gender and sexual norms. And you can see this in the postcards attacking suffragists of the era. So anti-suffragists caricatured suffragists as mannish women, calling them out for the ways that they did transgress gender norms in their daily behavior, but also through their clothing, through their desire for the vote alone. They used terms like mannish and masculine. They referred to these women as spinsters or abnormal women. And all of those were kind of code for implying some sort of deviance, right? Sexual deviance or homosexuality. And women weren't the only ones subject to this. Men who supported suffrage were also subject to this. They were implied to be sexually abnormal. The term suffragette was often used at this time period to mock men who supported women's right to vote. It was implied that they had been browbeaten into submission by their suffragist wives, mothers, sisters. And the anti-suffragists kind of created this imaginary world where if women won the vote, then men would be subjected to domestic chores and would be humiliated, would be emasculated by this. And there were names. They called them mollycoddles, willy boys, sissies. These were the names that were used to emasculate men who supported women's right to vote. And I think the implication here, and you can see this in this postcard, is that if suffragists are so desiring the vote and men's privilege, that there must be something wrong with them. They must be something other than heterosexual wives and mothers. And today we might refer to individuals as asexual, bisexual, or lesbian. But at the time, the term generally used in science, at least, was a sexual invert, or sometimes you would see them refer to people as the third sex. But the more common that you would see like in newspapers and articles would be mannish woman or abnormal women. So anti-suffragists really did fear that if women win the vote, there would be a complete upending of gender norms and that women would reject men and essentially turn against heterosexuality and against marriage. So keep in mind that just the fact that they're pushing for the vote this time is upending gender norms, right? It's the unexpected for that era. They're pushing the boundaries of what is even acceptable for women by standing out on the streets, campaigning for the vote, marching for women's suffrage. So many of the suffrage leaders thought if they're going to win support for their cause, because they're already out there pushing the limits, that they needed to be as respectable as possible. So this often meant highlighting the women in their movement that were traditional wives and mothers in that sense. So Anna Howard Shaw is a great example of this. So Anna Howard Shaw was the president of NASA, was insistent that we have to keep up this respectable public image. And part of that came from her experience throughout her youth. Now, Tricia Franzen has written a great biography on Anna Howard Shaw, and I highly recommend it. And Franzen pointed out that when Shaw was a young woman, she kept her haircut really short. In some ways, her fashion was more masculine, and she was more masculine presenting in a lot of her presentations, but that she quickly realized that this resulted in a lot of criticism and a lot of backlash. And so later in her career, she tended to dress more modestly, but also more what was expected, kind of professional clothing at the time. And she began to cultivate a feminine charm, like a public persona. And part of this was because she feared that any criticisms of her appearance would detract from the message that she wanted to get across. So essentially, she chose to downplay herself, her own kind of more masculine gender presentation, to grow her hair long, to dress in a more conservative, professional way. And to do this in order to focus on the message that she wanted to send. And she said, no woman in public life can really afford to make herself conspicuous by any eccentricity in her dress or her appearance. And so she actually warned other suffragists of the same thing. And as one of the leaders of the suffrage movement, right, it was this idea that we have to at least put forward like a respectable persona in order to gain support for our cause. So what we see then is the major suffrage organizations launching these publicity campaigns that kind of fight back against the anti-suffragist image of them as these mannish, abnormal women. And they end up like pushing to the front of the movement women who were wives and mothers and who kind of demonstrated that heteronormativity and respectable femininity that was expected of them. And you see, like, there's suffragists who are recommending to other women that they need to, dress well, be attractive, be charming, be lovable. This is the way to win suffrage from men. So these guidelines then are oftentimes unspoken, but sometimes they're directly written codes of behavior for suffragists. Sometimes they recommended, that all suffragists wear white, that they dress in a certain way, that they behave in a certain way as they march through the streets. So there was kind of a code for how the suffragists were supposed to act. And they promoted these stories that focused on beautiful, young, affluent, upper middle class suffragists. And they kind of pushed that to the forefront of the campaign. And you can see that in some of the imagery that comes out of the suffrage parades. For instance, here they're dressed all in white. They're literally parading with their children as they're marching down the street. And the idea is to show that, they're respectable future citizens, they're waving the flag, and that they're respectable wives and mothers. And I think that's the point. And because they had been criticized as being horrible mothers, I think they also wanted to highlight their children as healthy future citizens as well. But as the book makes clear, the suffragists were a wide variety of women who came from a lot of different backgrounds. And there was no kind of single way to characterize them. There were women that, if they were alive today, might identify as heterosexual, or they might identify as bi, pan, asexual. So what happened is these suffragists who rejected norms entirely, women who didn't want in any way to kind of conform to any preconceived idea of femininity, that were defying the norms in their gender expression. So like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who wore more masculine clothing, over time shifted to wearing men's clothing. In 1880, she experienced a lot of public criticism for her appearance, for her clothing, and she was arrested. And when she was arrested, asked why she was wearing the clothing that she was. And she said, "I'm not wearing men's clothing, I'm wearing my own clothing." And I think that was a point that she made over and over again, is that she had the right to dress the way that she pleased, and that she was advocating for dress reform. She was actually a dress reformer, advocating that women should be able to wear more comfortable, less restrictive, healthier clothing. But over time, she began to adopt more and more masculine clothing. And her appearance, which today we might say is gender queer, right, was definitely extremely radical for the time, because even though earlier suffragists had adopted dress reform as part of their movement, by this point in time, by the late 19th century, they had rejected that movement and had turned more toward wearing more traditionally feminine clothing. But Walker continued to advocate for dress reform and continued to really stand outside what was considered normal at that time. She was viewed completely as a radical by other mainstream suffragists. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton particularly did not like Walker and tried to distance herself and the organization entirely from Walker. And there's correspondence between her and Susan B. Anthony talking about, not wanting Walker to speak, also not wanting to have Walker included in the history of the suffrage movement that they were writing. And so part of this history is erased because literally women were removed, queer suffragists were removed from the history. They were literally erased from the history in this way. Another gender nonconforming suffragist was Annie Tinker, who came from New York. Annie Tinker is really fascinating. She was born the generation after Walker. She was among the younger suffragists in the early 20th century. And she also kind of did what she pleased. She wore what she wanted. She wasn't conforming to what was considered traditional feminine dress at the time. And she became famous for marching down the street during the New York suffrage parade, dressed in masculine clothing and riding astride on horseback, and leading a cavalry of suffragists through the streets. And so this was kind of, mocked in the press. They looked at her mannish appearance, and but they also found it fascinating. The press flocked to her. She got a lot of media attention. Other suffragists just kind of tried to distance themselves and painted her as kind of a socialite, an eccentric woman, rich woman, and tried to kind of distance their movement from her. But when Tinker had a chance to speak to the media, she would talk about women's rights in a much more expanded way than just the vote. One thing she was really advocating for was for women's rights to pursue any career of their choice. And I think one of the reporters asked her, does that include the military? And she said, yes, if women want to fight in the war, they can fight in the war. So I think this was just an example of just how she really pushed the women's rights movements to the margins. Similarly, we have Margaret Chung, who's from San Francisco, LA originally. Margaret Chung was, she defied gender conventions in many ways, not just in her clothing. When she was a young woman, she wore more masculine clothing, but also she was pursuing a career as a doctor. And as a Chinese American woman, this was really standing outside the norms of her day. She actually adopted the name Mike. She asked friends to call her Mike. And she wore her hair slicked back. She wore men's clothing, men's jackets, men's hat, and carried a cane. And she got a lot of attention for this, for her behavior, for her choice of career, for her advocacy for women's rights, not only in the United States, but for in China as well, because she was fighting against segregation, against exclusion at the time. So she was advocating for, again, a broader vision of women's rights beyond just the vote, but also talking about securing for Chinese American women freedom from exclusion and discrimination and segregation. You also have women who beyond gender norms, right, are challenging this idea that all women need to get married. They're challenging this kind of heteronormative, heterosexual structure. So I think my favorite example for this is Belle Squire. Belle was from Chicago, and she very publicly expressed her refusal to ever get married. She said, I'd rather have a vote than a husband, when she was asked by the newspaper. She said, because with a vote, a woman's wages, her dignity, her position are raised. With a husband, they may be lowered. So her choice not to marry was very radical in that time period. Again, most women were expected to marry, and most women did marry. But she's kind of challenging this idea. And this is getting a lot of pushback. Remember, anti-suffragists created that whole image of the spinster woman as suffragists as being sexually abnormal. And so she's kind of pushing back against that too, saying, no, it's normal for women to not want to get married, and it should be considered okay. And one of the things that she did, which is also kind of funny, is she insisted on being called Mrs. Belle Squire. If you notice in this newspaper here, the Mrs. is in quotes, right? And they asked her why, and she said because that's an honorific title, and that she didn't want to be treated like a young unmarried woman. She wanted to be treated with proper respect, and so that title allowed her to have that respect. So she said, I'll take the Mrs. without the husband. Another suffragist that would be considered queer in our modern terms, Angelina Weld Grimke, was a Black suffragist, a writer whose work called attention to racial inequality as well as women's rights. She and her family were very well known for their activism from the abolition movement and to the suffrage movement. They worked with the National Association of Colored Women. They fought for Black women's voting rights. They organized against racial segregation and discrimination. But she was personally most well known as a writer and a poet, a playwright. And her poems became kind of emblematic of the later era, of the Harlem Renaissance. And most of her poems are published. They're amazing, right? But she has several poems that are never published. She never wanted them to be published. And these poems really do reveal her queer desire. These poems talk about her love for a woman. And these were never published. We think her concern was not wanting to make these public and to any way cast any scrutiny on her family. But we know that her poems do express this queer desire. So this one is an example that was written in her journal, again, never published. And I don't know if you can read it, but it says, little lady coyly shy, with deep shadows in each eye, cast by lashes soft and long, tender lips just bowed for song. And I oft have dreamed the bliss of the nectar in one kiss. So again, several of her poems express this desire for another woman. I think you've all probably heard of Boston marriages and how popular that was at the time. Boston marriages was a term generally used to describe two women who lived together. And these could be what we would consider like a modern roommate situation. They could be considered like a business partnership, or in many cases, they were romantic relationships. It's important to note, though, that these were not, while these were common, right? They were not like, there was not a lot of them. It wasn't like they were so ubiquitous that everybody talked about them all the time. This was a challenge to traditional norms. Just the fact that these two women were living together, choosing not to get married, become old spinsters together in modern terms. It's also important to note that most people didn't really see these as romantic or relationships. They were kind of existing outside. I think most people saw them as asexual old spinsters. But for many of these women, especially queer women at the time, lesbians or women who wanted to be together, be with another woman, this allowed an opportunity to live in a same-sex relationship without necessarily having to endure intense scrutiny for it, because these kind of spinster cohabiting together things was more common. Scholars have documented lots of cases of Boston marriages, especially in and around Boston, where all the women's schools were, but also in the suffrage movement. So here's a few examples of some very well-known suffragists who lived in Boston marriages at the time. And that's one of the things that I think surprised me the most when I started doing this research, is just how many of these women were in Boston marriages. So one of my favorite examples from this as well is Margaret Foley. Margaret Foley was one of the most popular speakers in the suffrage movement. She came from Boston. She was from an Irish American family. She was a working class woman. She worked as a hatter in a hat factory. She was a labor organizer with the Boston Women's Trade Union League. And in 1906, she was hired by the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association to campaign. And she began traveling around campaigning for suffrage. She actually went on a cross-country tour at one point, and the press loved to follow her around because she was such an amazing speaker. And also, she was pretty famous for interrupting male politicians to ask them what their stance was on women's right to vote. And this earned her the nickname of the Great Heckler. So she was really well known in the press for this behavior. And as a kind of a mini celebrity, she was also well known by other suffragists who all wanted to work with her. So she had a lot of friends in the suffrage movement. She had a lot of male suitors too. It seems like a lot of men wanted to marry her. Men flirted with her. Her papers on file at the archives are fascinating because there are actual love letters from men to her. There are conversations with her friends who were trying to set her up with a man to marry, trying to play matchmaker. And so there's lots of examples of this in her papers. One of the most interesting one is a series of letters from a man who's trying to seduce her and is very open about this. And it's really unclear, honestly, if she had any feelings for him in return or returned any of the sentiments of any of these men, because there isn't really any crossway correspondence that I was able to find. But what we do know is that she absolutely refused to marry. She did not believe in marriage. She believed it was too restrictive. What's interesting is Foley met Helen Goodnow while they were traveling across the country together. So being a suffragist afforded them opportunities to meet lots of other women, right? And to room together, to live in close quarters with other women. So they traveled across the country together. They ended up spending quite a bit of time together on the trail. They lived together, they roomed together during this time period. And we have Goodnow's letters to her grandmother where she's talking about just the fantastic time she's having. And she just kind of gushes about how much she adores Margaret Foley and just how much their life is, how amazing their life is on the trail, and how much, she loves her, and she just gushes about her relationship and how much time they're spending together. Now, eventually the campaign ends and they decide to spend a week together on a vacation. And it's at that point that they decide that there's more to their relationship, and they end up moving in together. And they become a very well-known Boston marriage couple. They end up living together for over 40 years, and that doesn't end until Foley passes away. So again, an example of a local Boston marriage for you. Some of these Boston marriages resulted in children. A good example of this is Anna Woods Bird and Mary Malone. They worked on the suffrage campaign together as well. They retired, they moved to a farm, I think it was in Pennsylvania, and they ended up adopting a child together. And they raised the child as if the child was their own. Later on, we have other suffragists who do similar things. Elizabeth Irwin, Catherine Anthony actually raised children together, and they named the children after themselves. So it's really interesting the way that they kind of adopted what maybe a heterosexual couple might do, naming children after themselves, adding junior on the end as well. One queer suffragist I like to talk about too, because he really stands outside the norm of his time, is Albert Eugene de Forest. So de Forest, if he were alive today, might identify as a trans man. He lived in 19th century San Francisco Bay Area, around San Jose, Berkeley, at different points in time. And he was assigned female at birth. And despite his objections throughout his childhood that he was a boy, he was forced to dress and live his childhood as a girl. So his parents didn't listen to him and forced him to conform. As an adult, he formally declared and publicly declared his true gender identity. And he did this by publishing an announcement in a local Berkeley newspaper, changing his name formally to Albert Eugene de Forest and declaring himself a Christian gentleman by birth. So he did this by taking out an ad in the paper. Now, California suffragist Alida Avery became his adopted mother. So Avery was a physician, and she had actually worked at the college that de Forest had attended when he was a young person. And he became close friends with her. She became kind of a mentor to him. So as an adult, when he moved out to California, he roomed from time to time with Avery. And he told the newspaper at one point that he saw her as entirely his adopted mother and was grateful to him as his kind of chosen family. He had no ties with his birth family at that point. Another example of someone in his chosen family was Clara Foltz, who was an attorney in San Jose at the time and was active in the suffrage movement, was one of the leaders of the California suffrage movement, and knew Avery through their connection there. So all of them worked in the California suffrage movement. And Foltz ends up providing, not only being his chosen family, providing friendship, but ends up providing legal assistance later in his life. De Forest is eventually arrested by police for violating cross-dressing laws in the time period. They discover his gender history, and he ends up having to go in before the court to defend himself. So Foltz comes to his aid, serves as an attorney, defends him, pushes back against the legal charges, and basically argues before the court that he should be allowed to live his life as he pleases, to dress as he pleases. And she does this, and they successfully win that case. A few years later, he's admitted to the hospital. He actually ends up with pneumonia, and they put him in the women's ward. So again, his attorney comes in, helps him out, and they fight, and he gets moved to the men's ward. So that's just an example of like queer suffragists and how they kind of form families for each other, chosen families to support each other during this time period. And I think it's fascinating because we do have examples of trans men during this time period. And again, those terms didn't exist, but if they were alive today, would identify most likely as trans men. Alice Morgan Wright is super cool suffragist as well, from Albany, New York. She's the one on the right in this image. Alice Morgan Wright is an example of not only how suffragists kind of form chosen families, but how they form connections and kind of what I'll call queer friendships with other suffragists that prove so essential to kind of keeping the suffrage movement together and to forming these like alliances even across the Atlantic. So Alice was a young upper middle class woman. She wanted to study art. She ends up going to Europe, to Paris, to study sculpture. And while she's traveling across the Atlantic, she meets one of her heroes, Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of the militant suffrage movement in England, in Britain at the time. So Wright is just enamored with her hero, Pankhurst, and they become very good friends. And I would say at this point, Wright has a crush on Pankhurst. She actually writes to friends saying how much she absolutely adores Pankhurst, how much she loves her. But Wright has to go on to travel to Paris to study art. And I think Pankhurst probably had a lot of young suffragists have crushes on her. And so she, just treated her as like one of the young women who admired her, sent her letters, and encouraged her activism in the suffrage movement. At one point, it gets so it heats up. The suffrage campaign in England heats up so much that they begin to launch a mass window breaking campaign. This was March 1912. Hundreds of suffragists are arrested in this mass window breaking campaign. And Wright could not help herself. She wanted to be a part of it. She had been writing to Pankhurst. She knew this was coming. So she travels over to London, and she's arrested literally holding a rock in her hand that says votes for women, right? And so once she's arrested, the case becomes news all over New York in American newspapers that an American girl is arrested in England. And her parents are absolutely horrified to have their name in the papers like this. So they rush over to England. They start pleading with authorities for her release. But the funny part is that Wright was having the absolute time of her life in prison. She was on hunger strike, and she was having the time of her life because she was there with hundreds of other suffragists, and she was so excited to be a part of this moment in history. She ends up writing love poems to Emmeline during the time, and I found those at Smith. They're on old pieces of tiny prison paper in pencil. They're very difficult to read, but they're love poems written to Emmeline Pankhurst at the time. And she actually created a little tiny sculpture of Emmeline's head at the time. And so this just shows you like how intense these relationships, these queer crushes could be between these women. She's eventually released from jail. Her parents may make her absolutely promise she's never going to get arrested again. They send her back to New York. She finishes school in Paris, but ends up going back to New York. And she doesn't get that actively involved. Again, she's active as a suffragist, but not so much as a militant suffragist, probably because she was chastised so much by her parents. But she continues working in the suffrage movement, and she ends up living the rest of her life with another suffragist in a Boston marriage. But her queer crush on Pankhurst helped seal important alliances between the British suffrage movement and the US suffrage movement. And she ends up sponsoring them several times to come out and speak and hosting them at her family house. And so there's important connections that are made as a result of this. And another story, probably the last story I want to share today for time, but is Gail Laughlin and Dr. Mary Sperry. These are actually, Laughlin is from Maine and Sperry is from California. So they're kind of local to my area, and they end up together for a long time in San Francisco. So what happened is Laughlin was an amazing speaker. She was actually hired by the California suffrage campaign to come out and help organize suffrage groups in California. So she ends up coming out to California, and she works with Dr. Mary Sperry's mother. So Dr. Mary Sperry was a physician at the time working in San Francisco, and her mother was the president of the California suffrage campaign. So that's how Gail ends up meeting Dr. Sperry. And so the elder Sperry, the mother, was concerned because Laughlin and her daughter became very, very close. And in fact, at one point when the campaign in California is over, they move away together and they spend, I think, 7 or 8 years together, living together in Colorado. So what we know is that there was tension in the Sperry family over this relationship, but I think they kept it kind of more private, in part probably because they were so active and prominent in the suffrage campaign. However, these very private tensions come dramatically to light when Dr. Sperry actually passes away very unexpectedly at a young age. She dies in the 1919 influenza epidemic in San Francisco. And much to the family's surprise, they find out that in her will, she has given everything to Laughlin, all of her property, all of her interest and rights, and even asked that Laughlin care for her bodily remains. So this is where it gets very, they come into conflict, right? They go to court over this. They contest the will. Laughlin is supposed to take care of Sperry's remains. The family doesn't want that. They want Dr. Sperry buried in the family plot in Stockton, and Laughlin contests that. They end up going to court to argue over this. And in court, Mother Sperry ends up saying that, Laughlin had poisoned her daughter's mind. She says she's mannish, she's masculine, she's domineering. So that phrase is basically code for that time period for lesbian, right? They're saying that she is not a normal woman. She's an abnormal woman. She also told the court that Laughlin was her daughter's constant companion and that they even shared the same bed. So again, implying that there's something wrong with them in that case. The court ends up validating Sperry's will as is and honoring her wishes. But the Sperry family was absolutely furious. In the family plot in Stockton, they end up inscribing the name of Mary Sperry there as if she was there because they believe that was her rightful place. But she's not there. It says in memoriam because her ashes were given to Laughlin as per Mary Sperry's request. So I think this is interesting because this story, right, really tells you about, I think, the importance of these queer relationships, but also it tells you a little bit about erasure. And the reason I say that is because there was a biography written about Gail Laughlin, but the descendants in the biography never mention Sperry. I think they mention Mary Sperry on one paragraph and they just kind of dismiss her as a close friend. They don't mention their relationship, I should say. So there's no really discussion of this court case, of their life together. They spent 14 years together. There's no mention of it in the biography. And you could say that maybe the biographer didn't know about it. The biographer was a descendant, but I don't think that's true because when Gail Laughlin died in 1952, she requested that the couple's remains be interred in the same grave in the Laughlin family plot in Maine. And they both are buried together under a single marker as per her request. I think it's fascinating because this simple brass marker really just symbolizes their life together, their commitment to each other in this world and beyond. I think it's interesting that the biographer never mentions Sperry, but it shows you that process of erasure. It's also interesting because this led me on a totally different research path. I started trying to figure out, were there other suffragists buried together? And I found that there were. Oftentimes, again, they were in Boston marriages. They lived their life together and they were buried together. So this was kind of a way that they, again, challenged norms even into their death, right? I think it's interesting too, because they're also etching into stone some remembrance of their life together, standing as kind of a symbol of queer love over time. So this is one of my favorite stories, just because I think it shows the intensity of these relationships and their importance in the suffrage campaign. I also want to point out as I wrap up here that, it's really important when we study the past to think about why we're studying in the past. And I think obviously we want to understand our own history. I think that's what leads most of us to studying history, is we want to know more about ourselves and about our ancestors, the people who came before. But I think it's also important that, one goal of studying history is also to understand other people in our community, to try to build more compassion for the people that we interact with on a daily basis. And especially right now with LGBTQ rights under attack, all about the Don't Say Gay laws in Florida, attempts to erase queer history. I think it's really important to tell these stories because history reminds us that, that queer people have always existed and you can't erase them. No matter what, queer people have always existed. And so I think it's really important to learn this history, learn these stories, and to keep sharing them. Okay, now I'm going to take a few minutes and look at the question and answer. So if you have any questions for me, if you want to add them to the to the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, so Kelly Marino, hi Kelly, good to see you virtually, I guess. And you said Kelly does research, by the way, on the suffrage movement. So excited to have you here. And you said you've been waiting a long time to talk with me. Nice to see you. And Edith Hooker is an example of a woman who fit the profile that we've been discussing. She was a suffragist who had smashes in college and dressed in more masculine clothing. That's so cool. I'd love to learn more. If you are interested in like smashes and crushes and Boston marriages, I did write an article and I'm happy to share that. I think the link to it is actually on my website. It's all about smashes and crushes among college women, especially in the New England schools at the time, and kind of like what these relationships were like. And so I do have like examples of that and of their letters and whatnot there. So Kelly, thank you for that. I'd love to know more. Maybe we can chat about that. Okay, so another question from Jocelyn is, what made you want to study queer history and voting rights? I think it started with me being just curious about the lives of the suffragists, because I would do the lecture every year on, especially like we would show iron-jawed angels in my history class that I taught. And I think that made me really curious about what their real lives were, not just the story that was told for a film, but what were the lives of individual suffragists. And once I started looking into that and like how their suffrage activism impacted their personal lives, that's when I noticed just how queer it was. And as a queer woman myself, I found that fascinating that was not a story that I had heard much about. I know Lillian Fatterman has written a lot on that, but I didn't know much about some of these suffragists and their day-to-day life. So I thought maybe I could find more information on that. So that's, I think, what led me into wanting to do more history on the queer history of the suffrage movement. So thank you for that question. And then you also asked, were most people a part of the queer suffrage movement Caucasian or white, right? If so, why do you think that was? There was a Black suffrage movement at the time as well, but there's obviously a lot of segregation and discrimination in the white suffrage movement, even though Black suffragists and white suffragists sometimes work together. In the suffrage movement, we have Alice Dunbar Nelson, who I didn't talk about today, but Alice Dunbar Nelson was a Black suffragist who worked with NASA and was an organizer for NASA. But when Alice would speak, she would talk about not just women's right to vote, but specifically like the violence that the Black community faced and the racialized violence, the discrimination. She talked about housing issues and things like that. And so I think that the segregation and discrimination within the white suffrage movement really created a lot more division and hostility. And especially once the 19th Amendment is passed, right? It's not universally all women have the right to vote. There are still efforts to disenfranchise Black voters. There are still laws restricting who can vote and attempts to prevent Black people from voting. And so I think that Black women then continue on fighting for full access to the vote long after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And that becomes a point of conflict as well with white suffragists. Okay, were the children, Diana, you asked, were the children seen as other, or were they able to interact in society without bias? So I think, okay, so you're talking about the children of Boston marriages. I don't know that there's enough evidence to really address this. Like, it was hard enough just finding the evidence that some of these suffragists did indeed have children, but we don't know much about what their lives were like. Now, I know it was very common for people to adopt children from various child protective societies at the time. And that, so I think in some ways it was seen as like, they're doing a service for society, a service for the children. So kind of like a higher moral calling to adopt children at that time. I don't think that most people saw Boston marriages as a same-sex marriage, a same-sex relationship. I think they saw it as two old spinsters living together. So when framed in that way, then it could become like acceptable for society. So I think that they weren't necessarily seen as like a gay couple's children, right? Like they would be today. So I hope that kind of answers it. How could two women adopt a child at a time? One of the women would technically file for adoption rights. So in those cases, one of the women was technically the adopted mother at the time. Again, there were so many children that needed support and care. There wasn't the strict foster system that we have today. So I think anybody who was willing to care for a child, it was pretty much easy to adopt. How did the world react to Anna Woods Bird and Mary Malone? Okay, good question. I think they were seen mostly as spinster couple. And I think too, that part of the fact that one of the reasons they were kind of shielded from scrutiny in these Boston marriages is these are middle upper class educated white women who were very active in society. So for the most part, they are engaged in their community in a way that is seen as virtuous, like moral, right? So I think they're respected in that sense. And I don't think people are questioning their private lives as much because of that. They're adhering to norms of respectability in other ways besides their Boston marriage. Okay, Michael, thank you for the question about erasure. I think this is just a super important question. So your question is, how do we uncover more about queer history and talk about erasure? Okay, so one of the ways that queer folks in the past are erased is by not talking about the person that they lived with or their long-term Boston marriage, their long-term partner. And so in the Laughlin case, this biographer who was a member of the family never mentioned Sperry, even though for 14 years they lived together, even though they're buried side by side, right? It's just a casual mention of, oh, and she had this friend named Mary Sperry. You see that. You also see coded language. You see close friends, or today people kind of say roommate, but back then they would say close friends or closest companion. So that's a form of erasure because it kind of dismisses just how intense this relationship was. There are literally love letters between a lot of these women. And one way that was erased was sometimes the suffragists themselves would burn these letters later in their life, especially if they lived into the 50s, which was a very homophobic era. And there was the Lavender Scare and efforts to oust gay people from their jobs. The government actually, fired people who were gay. And so if they lived into that era, there was a number of them who burned their papers, their private papers, because they didn't want their reputation sullied in that way if people read their love letters. So that was one way of erasure. The other is just descendants, like even if we still have their love letters, like Alice Morgan Wright. We have Alice Morgan Wright's letters, a lot of her love poems to other women in college. I mean, it's very clear she lived a queer life. But her partner, who outlived her, actually removed all of their letters from her files. So I don't know what was written there. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's just missing because people wanted to kind of sanitize their lives, preserve the reputation. I know a lot of the biographies written in the 70s and 80s of suffragists don't mention anything about their partners or their queer lives. So just like effort to kind of sanitize it. Uncovering queer history is very, very difficult. First, you have to try to locate what's missing. You have to try to figure out what letters are not here and why, or what information is, and we call this like the archival silences, like literally what's missing in the archives. So for Alice Morgan Wright, I went through all of her papers and she had extensive correspondence and writings, but I noticed that her letters to the woman she lived with are missing. So I had to go on a hunt to figure out why, where were they? What happened to them. And that kind of told a story too, right? Just the fact that they were missing, and it turned out that her partner had asked that they be removed from the collection. And I believe her partner must have destroyed them because they don't exist, as far as I know. So it's a lot of like reading between the lines and trying to uncover. Why I do know about Wright's like queer love interests when she was a young woman was because in the backs of some of her old notebooks, like scratched out are literally like poems that she wrote. And you have to really look hard to even notice them. I'm sure whoever donated the files to the archives never read those, didn't know what was in there, but they're definitely love poems to other women. So you have to look, read the archival silences and read between the lines to try to uncover queer history. So hopefully more work will be done on this in the future. But it was one of the most fascinating parts of this. It's where you feel like a real detective doing historical research. But it's also one of the harder parts about it because it's not as obvious. A lot of the stuff that I found about their relationships was around the time of their death, where in their wills, in their probate cases, like there's a lot of information that comes out about their life together that you wouldn't see in the traditional documents. So that was another area I didn't expect to go in, but I ended up doing a lot of research around their deaths to try to fill in the blanks. Were Boston marriages noted in other areas around the country? And if so, were they called Boston marriages? Yeah, so Boston marriage is kind of a phenomenon we see across the country. It's mostly upper middle class women who live together. The term Boston marriages actually came from a novel at the time, and it was applied to two women who lived in Boston. And so that's why it got the nickname Boston marriages. So yeah, it was common across the country, and it wasn't just limited to Boston. Do I have a favorite person that I've researched? Margaret Foley was fun because of the letters that she had between some of the men, which were very amusing to read, the men who were flirting with her and wanted to marry her. I think Alice Morgan Wright was my favorite because I spent so much time with her papers that I feel like I kind of came to know her as an individual better. And her whole love story, across the Atlantic, having this crush on Emmeline Pankhurst was really, really fascinating. And I got to see her queer crushes in college with different women, her queer crush on Pankhurst, and then later the life that she lived together with her partner. So I think she was probably my favorite queer suffragist. Okay, so this question is about were there differences in treatment of gender across ethnic or racial lines, or among immigrant communities, and gender and sexual norms. There's not, so when we talk about like erasure and archival silences, right, we're not just talking about like queer people in the past, but obviously people of color, immigrant communities, Black people, like whose history gets told is part of whose history gets saved. So we do not have a lot of information about queer relationships in immigrant communities or across ethnic and racial lines. I found several cases of same-sex relationships, Boston marriages, and gender nonconforming suffragists in the Black community. But these were mostly upper class, middle upper class Black suffragists. And so I think, especially if we're talking about within immigrant communities or working class, lower class, there's just less evidence of it because there's less likelihood that history got saved for those particular individuals. So I think it becomes like kind of a double erasure or triple erasure, depending on race, class, and gender as well. Were there any openly lesbian relationships? Well, they didn't use the word lesbian, wasn't used at the time. So nobody came out and said, we live together. Like they said we live together because everybody knew about these Boston marriages, but there's not a sense of lesbian identity as a group, if I could explain it that way. Like the gay lesbian movement, right, comes along later on. You see more of a group identity among lesbians in maybe the 1920s and but definitely by 1940s and so on. So there's nobody coming out saying I'm a lesbian necessarily at this time. And they're definitely not talking about if there are two women that live together, they're definitely not talking about their sexual life together openly at all, right? Nobody's really doing that at all during this time period. So so I would say no, not in our definition today of openly lesbian. Okay, so Kylie, you mentioned that you're doing research on the suffrage movement in Wyoming, and you'd like to know more about coded language like smashes and crushes. So you're wondering if referring to another woman's hands and describing them could be coded language. I've not seen that specifically. It would depend, I guess, on what's said about that. And then you have also come across the term darling to refer to women who were dating other women on campus from the early 1900s. Yeah, I mean, darling, this is what's hard, is it's going to vary from place to place. So when I was looking at the crushes, I was looking at what was the norm in that context. So within that college community that you're looking at, what's the norm in the writing between each other? So if several of them are using the term darling, right, I would say that it's pretty common. To me, that seems more common for that time period to refer to their friends. Remember that they have romantic friendships too, which aren't the same necessarily as gay relationships as we would see them today, but they are relationships that maybe are characterized by hand holding and giving of gifts and maybe cuddling and whatnot. So they're romantic in that way, but they may or may not include sexual activity. And so I think that what's interesting about women's relationships at this time is that there's a wider spectrum of them than come along in, like, say, the 20th century, where we have gay and straight, right? So in this time period, during this time period in the 19th century, we might have gay and straight relationships, but we also have like romantic friendships and crushes and things like that, which we don't have necessarily in the same way later on. So as far as coded language goes, yes, you're looking at words like darling and things like that, but I think it's broader than that. You're looking at their relationship with each other. I think if they were in college in the late 19th century, they openly talked about smashes and crushes. The letters that I read from the college girls, they were just explicitly talking about so-and-so has a crush on so-and-so. So it was pretty open because crushes were considered a normal part of adolescent development. And they weren't frowned upon until about 1920 and onward, which is when they actually try to suppress schoolgirl crushes. So I think you would know if they have a crush on another woman from the way that they're talking about it, from this behavior associated with it, where they would literally be like a dating heterosexual couple at the time. But I'm happy to talk more about it with you if you'd like. Go ahead and email me and we can chat, and I'll send you that paper if you're interested. Yes, Eileen, you ask, were Boston marriages seen as asexual, and when and how did this change? Yeah, I think it was kind of a don't ask kind of policy, right? Because I think that was why they were largely like accepted, sort of, is because I think people just assumed that it was just roommates, that they were just two spinsters living together. How did that change? Okay, so literally that does change. And the article that I'm referring to, I talk about that. It changes around 1920, the 19 teens into the 1920s. And why that changes is because in the medical field at the time, the psychology field at the time, they start talking very openly, doing a lot of research on homosexuality. And they start to kind of create the binary, right? Which is there's homosexuals and there's heterosexuals. And in the process, as that kind of filters down into the mainstream, people start to see a clear distinction between homosexual and heterosexual, and some people start to pathologize that, to see that homosexuality is like a deviant behavior and heterosexuality is normal. And so if a young girl is having a crush on another girl, it could be a sign that someday she might become homosexual. So there's an effort to suppress crushes. And I think what happens is over time, the school system, the teachers, and the parents start to see these crushes as a sign that your child might be becoming abnormally developed. And so by the 1920s, there's efforts to literally smash the smashes, crush the crushes, prevent this from happening. As a result, people are no longer talking openly about their Boston marriages. This is where we kind of see the closet coming into play, where people are keeping their private lives completely private. So sometimes you'll meet people later on, you know, from this era, who nobody even knew that they really had a life together, that they lived together, or they didn't know anything about it because they really had to keep that completely private. So Boston marriages are seen as lesbian, homosexual, deviant relationships from about the 1920s on. And so people are much more closeted at that point. Okay, so this question is about whether queer women couples were forced to give up their adopted children, or were they denied the ability to fertilize with another woman. I think as far as no, they weren't forced to give up adopted children at this time period that I'm looking at. So this is pre-1920. I think again at this time, children, if a child needed a home and someone was willing to adopt them, I think it was pretty, as long, for the most part, it was welcome and encouraged. So a woman wanting to adopt a child, that was okay. So I think that answers your question.
Okay, I think that was everybody's questions. Wendy, thank you again for being here with us and for sharing this important part of queer history with us for Pride Month. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. Don't forget to get your copy of the book. You can get it through the NYU Press website. It's nyupress.org. And we also have copies